Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of Godot 101. Today we're going to be covering a simple topic, which is the basics of developing your game in Godot using C# and the Mono framework. There's many reasons why you might choose to use C#. For example, the performance is slightly better, or it can be roughly up to 4 times better. Not an order of magnitude better, but still going to be better performance than using GDScript. But a perhaps bigger motivation to use C# is that it's a more standard programming language. Not a lot of places use GDScript unless they're exclusively using it for Godot programming, whereas very many companies will be looking for C# developers. Other game engines use C#, and in general, it's a better practice to use C#. As you'll learn more about regular C-type programming languages, whereas Godot is more of a offset of Python, which itself is a C-type programming language, but it's not quite Python. So what you're using is pretty specific to Godot unless you switch over to C#, where then your knowledge and what you learn is more applicable to software engineering as a whole. So we'll be covering how to set up Godot to use the Mono C# support, as well as how to set up an IDE, or hopefully two, on how to build, develop, and debug your Godot games. That way you should be able to write your first Hello World script and or your first Hello World controller and be able to go from there as you develop. So we're not going to really cover the basics of C# programming and syntax as a whole. It's going to be more of just making a few brief changes to an existing controller. But we're not really going to be going through what is C#, what's the syntax, what are the things it can do. There's many C# tutorials that you can go watch online or read online, so I recommend those, but that's not going to be the topic of this. However, if you are trying to learn C# and you're pretty new to it, Godot's a great way to learn. So the first step is you're going to have to download the mono version of Godot, the standard version, which is what you'd get from, for example, from Steam, or if you're used to downloading it regular. The standard version isn't going to have the support that you need, so you've got to use the mono version. Make sure you pick the binary that you're interested in developing and publishing on. For example, I'm using 64-bit. In rare cases, you might need 32-bit, but most applications and most platforms support 64-bit. Once you download it, you'll get a zipped file, and for example, it'll look something like this, and inside you'll have the executable, as well as the, for example, the compile, debug, and release builds, and things like the Mono framework, and even some other tools, but we don't need to worry about those. The primary thing is I've already downloaded it and unzipped it, and you'll have a folder like this. Now, where you put Godot doesn't matter too much. What I would recommend is that you put it either somewhere where you can keep track of the version. If your game relies on version, for example, 3.2.3, you don't want to be switching it because it might cause weird behaviors or even break your game build. So either put it in a place where you can keep track of which version and point to it, or since it is only roughly 150 megabytes in size, here, if you've got the disk space, which I do, it doesn't really hurt to put it in your game folder. So for example, I have a folder called My C# Godot Game, and I have a bin folder, and so I unzipped it into this guy here. You don't have to do that, but it does make it a little easier to know exactly which version of Godot your game is relying on. And if you ever need to update it, then you can update this folder without affecting other games. It's up to you, but for this demonstration, I put it in here. Once you have this folder, the next thing I did is I made an empty project folder. There's nothing in here. You don't have to do this, but I recommend doing it just to help separate your project from the binaries. This would also be a place where we would put builds if you were building your game, or even asset repositories for your larger Photoshop documents or something that wouldn't necessarily go into the game, but might be used to produce assets for the game. Now, and of course the name bin doesn't have to be bin, that's just the name I gave it to. So once you have this project folder set up, we're going to go in and launch Godot. Launch it just like normal. Godot comes up like you would expect, and we can make a new project. So let's put that new project in our new folder. My game in project. Select this, and you can name it whatever, C# game. And we don't have to worry about the render, so we'll create and edit. And when you create the game, first thing that's going to pop up is a little message letting you know that the support is for C# being developed. So please submit issues or anything that comes up so that way you can help the development of Godot. And other than that, your Godot editor looks like everything you would expect. There's nothing significantly different here. The main difference is, and we'll go over to it, but there'll be a few more changes to support the Mono project. So the first thing you're going to want to do is go up into Editor and click Editor Settings. And we're going to be trying to do two things. First, we're going to scroll all the way down to the bottom where we have Mono. And you want to make sure that you configure your editor to be your preferred editor. There's a list of options here. Visual Studio is a very common one. I don't recommend Mono Develop, but it's perhaps been improved. But I would imagine most users are going to prefer either Visual Studio Code, Visual Studio, or JetBrains Rider. Personally, I prefer JetBrains Rider, so we'll go over the setup for that one first. But Visual Studio Code is a free alternative, and it's not quite as powerful as JetBrains or Visual Studio, but it'll get the job done. So when we configure the editor, that means it'll launch that editor when we try to edit a script. The next thing we have to configure is go down to the builds. And same thing, it's going to be looking for which MS build you're going to use. JetBrains Rider comes installed with MS Build, so you can select that one. But if you want to use Visual Studio, you'll have to install the Visual Studio Build tools. That is actually relatively straightforward to do. There's a link for it in the C# Basics documentation. And here you can download the build tools, which I've already done and started running. And there's a .NET Framework 4.5, which is what the documentation recommends that you install. So if you're going to go the Visual Studio route, either Visual Studio Code or Visual Studio proper, you'll want to use this framework, but otherwise you can use the one built into JetBrains Rider if you're using that. Now, JetBrains Rider, I just want to note, unless they have a free version, it is a paid subscription. So you'll probably want to go with the free Visual Studio Code if you're if you're a new developer, excuse me. But me, for example, I'm used to the JetBrains IDEs, so I prefer those. And by the way, everything I'm going over is in the C# Basics documentation, but I know that it helps a lot of people, including myself, to have a video that sort of walks through it with you. So for right now, let's assume that we're going to use JetBrains. So we're going to make sure that the editor and the builds are both using JetBrains, and we'll close the settings. Now, the next step that we'll want to do is we'll want to create a very basic scene. So I'm going to go to Node 2D, make a scene, and I'll make a node called player. Very simple. Now the first step is let's save our scene, and then we'll want to attach a new node script, and we'll want to make sure we select C#. By default, it should have GD script. Let's use C#. And you don't have to mess with anything else here. One thing to note is that I believe, unless it changes, the name of the script and the name of the class inside of the C# file have to match the node. So don't play around with the names too much because you can run into some trouble there. So we'll hit create. Now the reason why I want to create the node and the script first is that Godot is actually going to go in. So let's go back to the project folder. It's going to go in. It's actually going to create things like the project and solution as well as your script here. So it's actually going to do some initialization of the project for you. So we want to create that first node and that first script just to set everything up. Now, what we want to do next is set up our IDE. So I've already installed JetBrains Rider. You would also install Visual Studio if you prefer that. So let's launch Rider, and then we'll go over the configuration for Rider. All right, here comes Rider. So what we'll do is we'll just open, and we can go to our game, our project folder, and we can just select the solution. You can also just select the project folder, and that'll do the same thing. But for now, let's just go with the solution. And so here's our IDE. It's loading everything up. Now, here's our default player controller that was generated by Godot when we made the new script. A couple things to note is that we've got some scary red text indicating that Godot in system can't be found. Excuse me, and that's because we haven't set up our IDE quite yet. So we're going to do a few things. First, we'll go to File, go to Settings, and once we're here, we're going to go to Build, Execution, Deployment, and go to Toolset and Build. In here, we're going to double check the MS Build version. There's a couple of versions here. You can use whatever's auto-detected. Chances are it'll be perfectly fine. But for example, you could also switch to, say, the built-in Rider version of MS Build if you wanted to. These all three are using some 16.0 version of it, so they should all do the same thing. But just to make sure, if you don't have one that's already installed through .NET, you'll probably want to use the built-in JetBrains one. The next thing we'll want to do is go to the plugins, so Settings, Plugins, and we'll just search for Godot. And in here, we're going to want Godot support. This here is what allows the editor to integrate with Godot and run Godot. So make sure you have that installed, and you'll probably have to reboot the editor for the plugin to take effect. And once you have that, we'll hit Save. So that gives us a few things, like for example, learning to use how to run the builds for editor and player. But we'll see that it's still complaining about Godot in system, and that's because it doesn't know where the libraries are for Godot. To fix that, we'll go to our Solution Explorer, and we'll go down here to Dependencies, right-click, Add Reference, and we'll add from. Now this lets us select the DLLs to use for our references here. And so we're going to go back to my C# game, bin into the Godot version that you got, Godot Sharp, API, debug, and Godot Sharp.dll, and open that. We'll also, just for good measure, I'm not 100% sure if this is necessary, but we'll go into the API release Godot Sharp and add that. And for some reason, sometimes it doesn't always take, you can click on these and click Add here, and that should add those references to the project. While this is working, we can also go over the Visual Studio Code setup. So Visual Studio Code, you can install it just like normal. Once you've got the project open, the first thing we want to do, or sorry, once you've got the tool open, the first thing you'll do is go to the Extensions tab here, and you can search for two things. The first is C#. That gives you C# support in Visual Studio, so make sure you install it, which I already have. The next thing is to look for Godot. And you'll see here there's a C# tools for Godot. This helps with things like debugging, launching, building, etc. And so you want to install that as well. There's also this Godot tools, which I think might be a dependency, but I think this is the one you're looking for, C# tools for Godot. Install that, and you'll probably have to restart Visual Studio Code to get the plugins updated. Once you have that, you can open a folder. Once again, we can go to our C# game project and open this project folder. When it does, we'll see our solution here, and we can even bring up our script. Here it is. And finally, if we want to run this, there's multiple ways to do it. The first is to make sure you have Godot already running, and this is Visual Studio Code specific. Once you have Godot already running, you can click the Run tab here. Make sure you click Create Launch.json if you haven't already. It'll try to create a launch.json for your project. Once again, this is for Visual Studio Code specifically. Please create. All right. Sometimes you might have to open up the command palette, which is Control-Shift-P, and tell it to run Godot. And here it has our launch.json. I forget if it's a little tricky, so it can take a second for it to come up. But now that we have launch.json, if we go back to the Run tab, we'll see we have a number of options here. We have Launch, which will launch a new editor, Attach, which allows us to attach to an existing editor, and we have Play in Editor here, which will play the scene or in the existing editor that we've got running. I recommend that one. And so, for example, let's make a simple script that does hello world. Very simple. We'll say Godot.print to the console some message, which is hello world. We'll save it, and we'll play it in the editor. We do that. First thing we're going to say is, hey, we don't have a main scene, so let's select it. Let's pick our player scene as our main scene. It'll though build the solution. Nope. And I accidentally added a typo there. So once you've made a change like that, you can go into this Mono tab down here at the bottom and click Build Project, but there's also a helpful button up here in the top right that you can click to rebuild. Oh, and I left another typo in there. Let's rerun this in the editor. I will move this to be sideways. There we go. And so this sort of highlights a few of my frustrations with Visual Studio Code in that the way that I have it set up, at least, it's not very good at syntax highlighting and auto-completion. So I'm having a lot of issues where I'm just adding typos to my code and it doesn't work. Who would have guessed? All right, so the project is built. It's ready to go. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a breakpoint and play our game in the editor. Here we can see it's rebuilding. And what we want, allow access, and what we want is to see, hey, we've hit that breakpoint in Visual Studio. We've got things like this object, we've got the file name, all of these variables that are very useful for debugging. I do prefer this debugger over the built-in Godot debugger. And we can see that we've hit the breakpoint here on the hello world. I will get rid of the breakpoint and hit continue. And we'll see that, hey, it printed hello world to the console. So there we go, we've built our first script here in C#. Once again, I'll probably do most of my personal development here in JetBrains Rider, but Visual Studio Code is, if you're a beginner, it's a great IDE, and it's useful for more than just programming C#. I use it for things like viewing JSON files or CSV files. There's a ton of helpful extensions to help with pretty much anything you're working on. You can even do things like Python development, and I bet you there's a way to do GD script development in Visual Studio Code. I just haven't set that up before. So now that we've got this set up, I do want to point out just a few common things that people will probably want to do. For example, the first common one that a lot of people do is exporting a variable. To do that, it's going to look a little different than we have in Godot. But we'll put this export annotation here in the brackets. We'll say let's export a new public variable called, let's make it an integer, called player health, and we'll define it starts at 0. So here we'll see that player doesn't have that yet because we haven't rebuilt the project. So let's hit build, builds the solution, and hey, our player now has a script variable called player health. And as you can see, it's an integer, not a float. And we can mess with it. Perfect. Another common thing people might want to do, this is going to be a little different than in GD script, is let's make a new node. And let's call it some other. Oops, let's just call it other. Let's give it a new script, C#. We'll create it. And this one we'll look at here. We actually don't need to do anything to this, but let's say we wanted to reference, let's go back to this. Let's say we wanted to reference this child node in our player script. A way we could do that is we could make a private other type. This other is just the class that we created with this other script here. Other is just a node 2D, so very simple. We'll make a private other. So the type is other. We'll call it my other. Oops. And we'll not initialize it because it doesn't get initialized until the onReady has been called for our project. So what we'll want to do, oops, let's close this. What we'll want to do is in this ready override function here, we can then do something like my other equals get node, and actually, yeah, I think we can look in other like that, and let's set a breakpoint there. And so the hope is that by running this, we'll be able to get the other node from here. So let us run and play it in the editor. editor will start building again. Hopefully we didn't have any more syntax errors. Looks like we did. Oh, and that's because I missed something. So get node gives us just a node type, but we can also give it a template, which says we want a node that is templated into some other type. So let's say, let's get a node of type other at the path other. And let's stop it and play in editor again. There we go. All right, we've hit the breakpoint. We can use our debugger to step over. And now we have a my other. Let's go check it out. So in here, I'm going to scroll down so we can find it. Yeah, well, what we can do instead is add this to our watches. And we see it found a node. And we can even look and see, hey, there's the name is my other. And if we had any other variables here, we could find those. So for example, let's open that up and let's do something like public the other, or int other versus my health 100. Here we go. Let's stop, run, play the editor again. It'll rebuild. And then once it's done, we should hit the breakpoint. Step over. Now we have my other. And hey, my health is 100. So we know that we are accessing this other class. So there we go. We've done a few of the basics, such as exporting a variable and seeing that exported variable in the editor. We've been able to access other nodes, and most importantly, we've been able to do some of the debug stuff, such as printing a message in the console, or most importantly, setting up the debugger with a breakpoint so that way we can debug our program. Yep. So with that, we've basically covered the bare minimum for how to set up and run a C# project. Just remember that everything I covered is here in the C# basics. So don't think I invented all this. That's all listed down here. And then there's also a couple tutorials on C# specific features, API differences that I highly recommend you go through to figure out what's going on under the hood. And of course, the style guide is going to be a little bit different than the GT script that you might be used to. So please read through these. I'm not going to cover them because we could spend all day going over what I do and don't agree with. But otherwise, these pages here in the doc scripting C#, these are going to help you out a lot. So yeah, I think that just about wraps up this Godot 101 video. If you like this video, please don't forget to share it and subscribe. That really helps get the visibility out. And if you'd like to see more, I want to know about it. So please like and subscribe so I know what you guys are looking for. And if you have any more ideas of topics you'd like me to cover in videos like this, or if you want me to cover more specific C# implementation of things, please leave a comment below. And I'll review all of them, and hopefully we can see what you guys are after, and we can get a couple more videos up that help you guys if you're trying to do some more C# development or anything else in Godot. So, yep, thank you.